pharmaceutical industry, which is one that I've represented for many years, being able to produce chemical substances has been automated for many years. So a couple decades ago, I was sitting in a lab at Genentech with people who were sequencing DNA. They don't have to have access to the thing that they're sequencing, really the physical thing. They just need to know what the sequence is. And then in a room that's a fraction this big, they provide their computers that sequence information, and the reagents get put together in the right way so you get your fragment DNA. So what that means, but that has implications for genetic resources, for example. And this is a discussion internationally involving trade that is often void of factual anchoring. And this is where some countries say, look, if you want access to our viruses so that you can make a medicine or a vaccine to cure it, you're going to have to agree to, you're going to have to come here, sequence things, and take blood samples and all that sort of thing, and we're going to want a piece of whatever drug you get approved or vaccine you get approved from the FDA. Well, this is going on, and countries like, I've been told by one company trying to work on a Zika vaccine that the country, one country where that's endemic, doesn't want to give samples unless huge sums of money are paid. Well, whether you think that's right or wrong, and when I asked him, do you really need to go down there? Well, no, we don't. We just need the sequence, and that's being done there and published. So we just need the sequence, and it's a little more complicated with proteins than it is with DNA, because the 3D structure is not as well known for various proteins, but they can just make it in the lab. So the concept of what you have control over, even as a country, it needs to really be rethought, or at least some of these facts, these advances need to be brought into reality. The second thing where the current laws are out of step with our trade rules anyway, is where a company is considered to be located. I do most of my work for multinational corporations. And every country wants to think of a company as being theirs, if it's headquartered there. Companies don't think that way. And I've had discussions with USTR when they said, we don't want any of your members who are headquartered outside the United States to join in this conversation. Well, you have to understand that really doesn't make a lot of sense, because they're employing, some of these companies, GSK for example, is employing more people here than they're employing the country where they're headquartered. So all these discussions I think would be useful to have. This is going to be a snapshot of pharmaceutical issues. And I'm here because I've basically worked for the pharmaceutical, research-based pharmaceutical industry for a very long period of time. And I do a lot of my work for Pharma, which is a trade association here in town that represents the research-based industry, the ones that make new medicine, come up with medicines. And I'm their cleared advisor to the U.S. government, to USTR. So I've been very closely involved in all the trade negotiations and anything around the world, with whatever country the U.S. has an agreement with that might raise IP trade-related issues. The topics I'm going to touch on here are basically some of the economics that drive our industry, which is, I think, a fundamental understanding that is needed in order to understand why intellectual property is so important to our industry, not just here, but in every country where they operate, which makes it an international issue. I'll speak briefly about TPP. That used to be a big part of my presentation. It's less now because of circumstances, and we'll get into that in a moment. Global challenges, I'll give you at least a list of some of the global challenges that our industry faces, or things that developments in various countries around the world that we think are a problem for us. And I'm glad to talk about those in more detail. Each one could be a day-long lecture. But I'm glad to get into those, and please feel free to ask questions at any time. either during this presentation as well as afterwards. And then I'll talk a little bit about access to medicines, what the companies are doing, how that plays out, how we see that issue. Because it's always, I think, important to talk about access to medicines if you're going to talk about intellectual property in this industry. My first slide here simply lays out a little bit about some information about the business model, the R&D model here, and it's one that takes a long time. Your investments have to span 10 to 15 years, going from research bench to an approved product from the FDA. That takes on average 10 to 15 years. It also costs a lot of money. This slide says it's $1.2 billion on average, including failures. It's very important to understand that. It includes cost of failures. Now industry, this number is actually closer to $2 billion because the cost of basically the development costs associated with clinical trials has increased, has almost doubled in the last 5 to 7 years. But you can see it's also a high risk proposition. You have your drug discovery back here. Then you have a lead compound that you pick to try to take into clinical trials. And for every 5 of these that start phase 1 clinical trials, you'll get 1 approved FDA device. So you have a lot of failures. This activity here probably constitutes 70% of the expenditures required to get a drug product approved. So the research back here is much less expensive. This is where most of the NIH funding goes, and also a good part of industry funding. So that's the business model. And it's not an easy one to deal with, but those are the challenges we face. I mentioned failures. People don't often understand how many failures there are with a given product. What you and I see are the things that the pharmacist sells. But to get there, the industry in every instance goes through a lot of failures. This is a track record of Alzheimer's from 1998 forward. And you can see that there were 123 potential medicines. In the course of those years, since 1993, there have been 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 products approved for treating Alzheimer's. Each of these columns are lead compounds that were pushed, the companies tried to push through the regulatory system, but failed. Either they weren't able to prove they were safe, or they weren't able to prove that they were effective. Those are the 2 things you have to prove when you're getting approval from the FDA, or EMA, or any other regulatory entity. So you see there are lots of failures, 13, 14, 12. And I know that some of these, back in this time period, were the sunk costs that were walked away from exceeded $1.5 billion. So high risk, and for those, if there are any Canadians, the analogy sometimes used is a little bit like a hockey game where you have to take a lot of shots on goal to get 1 through. So high risk. This is a line that gives you a sense for when generic competition comes into play. The competitive landscape for our industry is really acute. And it's gotten more and more competitive as time goes on. The drug development time period, again, is around 10 years. You get an FDA approval, and this is when you first start making money. Okay? And the generic will come in almost always 12.5 years later, on average, for any product. So this is the time period when you you recoup your investments. And this time period, by the way, has gotten shorter and shorter. In the 1980s, it was closer to 17 years. So having generic competition is good for all of us who use medicine. I certainly do. We need it. It's part of our system. No one in my industry is complaining about that. But it's a challenge. And it's a challenge that we face all the time. Everyone thinks about competition in our industry as being the generic entry. But that's not the way our industry sees it. What we experience, what the companies experience, is, if you have a new chemical entity that is something that's a first-in-class product, you're going to see one of your competitors with its own IP portfolio coming in with a second-in-class product that operates a little different mode of mechanism, but it has its own, it's an IP-dependent product as well. It's not generic, it's just an alternative substance. That competition usually drops the price of the first-in-class by at least 25%. All right, and that entry, that second-in-class entry, which drops your revenue stream, used to be about 10.5 years after your FDA approval. Now it's on average 2.3 years. Sovaldi, some of you might have heard of, is a treatment for hepatitis C. It's very well known these days, talked about a lot because it was so expensive. Launched in 2014, very high price. First time that a company was able to offer a product that actually cured 90% of patients who have hepatitis C. It faced second-in-class competition from AbbVie less than 1 year after it launched its product. Market cap for Gilead, the company that brought us Sovaldi, dropped 14% in a day. So I don't know what the price delta was. That's all opaque because of the way pricing gets done in this country. But significant financial impacts involved. Having FDA approval is no guarantee that you're going to have a profitable product. It allows you to compete, to get out there, but only 2 in 10 of approved products make back more than the average cost of development. So you need a lot of, you can't, one success isn't going to do it for you, unless it's a real big blockbuster. And those are getting harder and harder to add. Okay, so very, very difficult competitive landscape. People often say about our companies that they're really just they're just focused on Me Too products. Basically, they're taking old things and giving us new stuff. I've never, again, I'd like more facts to be explored because this is a snapshot today, or after 2014 and 2015, I forget where the numbers came from, of the pipelines and what the companies are working on. And when you look at them in these therapeutic categories, you'll find that actually, for a neurological thing, that's Alzheimer's, it's Parkinson's, it's a lot of neurological. 84% would be first in class. Down here with infectious diseases, 57% would be first in class. And you can see that a lot of the pipelines are filled with fairly dynamic, potential beneficial products that we don't currently have today to treat these problems that are a problem not only in the United States or Europe, but increasingly globally, as everyone is in all emerging markets, I think, are facing the same kind of disease problems that we are here. Okay? So that's another little fact that if you're in discussions or hear discussions about this industry, bear in mind that they are trying to bring products to market that actually change things significantly for us. Research. It's sometimes said that our companies don't really do any basic research. That's all done by the governments, and you guys are just exploiters. Well, NIH spends about $30 billion a year. That's its current budget on its own research, intramural research, or on universities and other organizations. Our industry, the pharmaceutical industry, spends around $58 billion on research and development, some of which is on basic research. Like I said, about 70% of it is more in the clinical research phase. So this is just gives you a relative sense of what the two sectors are doing, the government sector and the business sector. And if you talk to people from NIH who are in charge of bringing whatever products they fund or discover themselves in their NIH labs, whether they can push all these through, or even a fraction of them through, significant fraction, and through the regulatory process, they'll tell you no. They really can't do it. So they're really, the environment that's required for successful R&D that brings you and all of us new products includes the government, but also includes the private sector, and it also includes academia and universities. This is just a line showing you the trajectory of R&D spend by our industry, the research-based industry, over time. So currently it's at least the US-based pharmaceutical industry, roughly 58, almost $60 billion, and it's been going up steadily for years. You'll also find that some of the government spending, NIH in particular, we're told is actually diminishing, at least the value is diminishing. I think the budget line is held relatively steady, but the value of that number is obviously depreciated over time. So the effective amount, at least being spent by NIH, is actually been eroded over a number of years. In the US, in this arena, is an outlier relative to all other countries. No other country spends anything approaching a significant fraction of what the United States spends. So, TPP, to get back to something you probably heard a great deal about, our industry had a lot of demands in TPP for intellectual property requirements or obligations. And I used to talk about all of those. Regulatory data protection was one of the key ones. Intellectual property or patent protection for new indications, new uses, effective enforcement system, basically rules on intellectual property that were pretty strong. The organization that I work for has me, I'm the representative on the ITAC. That stands for International Trade Advisory Committee. So we're the ones who talk to the U.S. government about what the industry wants and why. And there are ITACs for all industries, and there's one ITAC on intellectual property. We represent a lot of people who represent all the various sectors. So my job was to help articulate to the U.S. negotiators and other TPP countries, their negotiators, what we wanted and why we wanted it. In the end, you can see that the committee submitted a report to Congress, as is statutorily required to do by our laws, after the deal was closed, and it was generally positive. This is the first sentence, opening sentence of the report. And basically, they concluded, the committee did as a whole, that TPP advanced the interests of U.S. industry. But our industry, members of bio and pharma, that's me, basically, a couple of guys, stood back from that conclusion. So our industry, which is usually very free, is a pro-trade industry generally, really said what this means is we're not pushing aggressively to get this through Congress, which is what we're looked to do normally in free trade agreements after they're closed. So I'm glad to talk about that in greater detail if you want, but that's sort of a quick and dirty summary of TPP from the pharmaceutical perspective right now. When we were involved in Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, one of the themes we heard from all the countries was, look, if you increase the amount of time that we give you for data protection, which is basically a period of time after FDA approval, when generics can't piggyback on our approval of safety and efficacy. Okay? If you're a generic or biosimilar, you want to come in the market, you don't want to do your own clinical tests. That's really expensive, right? So what Congress has done and other countries do is say, all right, the pharmaceutical industry used to have infinite protection for its data. No one ever got to rely on it until the 1980s, when in this country Congress said, we're going to let generics rely on your proof of safety and efficacy data. All they have to prove is bioequivalence. for a generic. Something similar like to that has to be approved for biosimilar today. So that period of protection was reduced from infinite, from our perspective, in the 70s and 80s, down to 5 years in the United States. Okay, so after a product has been on the market for 5 years, they can start to piggyback on the data and use that to get their own approval for a generic product. So people said, look, you guys want more years. You want 8 or 12 years of data protection for biologics, which was our demand in TPP. That's going to bust our budget. Any significant increase is going to bust our budget. We heard that from Australia. Australians currently at 5. They said going to 8 would just bust our budget. Well, Canada went from 0 to 8 in one fell swoop in 2006, and you can see that their medicine spend relative to their overall healthcare spend has remained constant. People ask me, how could that be? And my short answer is, your health expenditures aren't based on a single factor. Throughout this time period, while you'll have new products coming on that are IP protected, you'll have older products going off IP protected. And you should be enjoying lots of savings. So there's a balance in place because of that constant, basically, movement of products out of the realm of IP protection when they're a lot cheaper. Also, your main drivers of health expenditures isn't necessarily intellectual property, it's demographics. If you have a fast-growing population of 68 and older, your healthcare expenses and your medicines expenses are going to go up. They just will. If demographically, population of people 20 to 25 is going up real fast, and everything else is stable, well, then your expenditure is going to be less. And if your population is increasing, your expenditures are going. Those are the big drivers of healthcare expenses, including medicines. And really, I think, while intellectual property is a factor, it's a smaller factor than people imagine. And in this country, 90% of prescriptions today are filled by generics. So the research-based industry that's spending the money on all those failures to get an Alzheimer's treatment that's more effective than what we got, relying on profits out of 10% of the market in the United States. So, out of TPP now, what are the global challenges that we see, or issues that we have with various countries? And I know there may be representatives from some of these countries here. I don't plan on going into great depth on any of these. Glad to talk to you offline or separately if you want. But basically, Brazil has a system where they have their regulatory agency, known as Anvisa, not only approve products or not approve products for marketing, but they'll decide whether or not a patent on a pharmaceutical product should be allowed or not. Extraordinary. Normally, the patentability decision is made very early, years before, 10 years or so before you've even gotten the product to the FDA or the market. And so it's odd, to say the least, that health regulatory authorities would have any role in deciding patentability. But they do in Brazil, significant problem from our perspective, significant trade issue. China, regulatory data protection. You know that China is a member of the WTO. Before they entered into that agreement, they negotiated with all the countries accession agreements. Their accession agreement with the United States obligated them to provide our industry 6 years, of regulatory data protection. To this day, we don't have any effective regulatory data protection in China. Why? It's because they said, well, we're only going to attach regulatory data protection to products that are launched first globally in China. How many of those are there? There's 0. Their ag sector, ag protection products, also get data protection, 10 years. That's what they agreed in their accession agreement. And in the ag sector, they give regulatory data protection of 10 years to any product that's new to the market in China, even if it's been launched globally years before, which is the way it's always done, which way it's done everywhere else. So there's a dichotomy even within or discrimination, even within the Chinese approach to our industry on data protection relative to what they've done with the ag sector. So that's a significant issue for us. Canada, the utility requirement. You want a patent anywhere in the world, you're going to have to prove three things: that it's useful, that it's novel, that it's different, and it's some kind of inventive step beyond just being different. In other words, it's not something just an ordinary engineer or scientist would come up with. Canada has interpreted its utility obligation in a way that has resulted in the elimination of patents on a huge percentage of pharmaceutical products. It's now a subject of ISDS, investor-state dispute, between Eli Lilly, one of the companies heavily impacted by that interpretation, and the government of Canada. So that's an ISDS case that's moving through the system. Investor-state dispute is in itself very controversial today. If you pick up the paper or if you watch trade discussions in the political realm, you'll find that it's a hot-button topic. Partly because of actions by the tobacco industry against regulations in Australia governing basically the packaging on cigarettes. So that's a big issue for us in Canada. India, they basically have a very narrow scope of patentability for certain kinds of innovative products. Many people call them follow-on products, new dosage formulations, new indications, all are very, very difficult to get patents in because of the way they define patentability in their laws. So those are four. You can see it's not just emerging markets or developing countries where we have issues. We have issues in developed countries as well. Compulsory licensing is an issue that we have around the globe, and occasionally these things crop up. Licensing regimes, many do. And so that's not the dispute from our perspective. It's a matter of how you implement it. The most recent one that was problematic for our industry occurred in Colombia, involving a product called Gleevec. It treats certain cancer diseases. I think in Colombia there are about 200 people who have this form of leukemia, I think. It treats other cancers too, but I think what's involved here was leukemia therapies, roughly 200 patients. Gleevec is made by Novartis, a Swiss company. They introduced the product to Colombia, and Colombia sets the prices. Okay, it's not a free market kind of place. So the government tells you what the maximum price you can pay. The company complied with that. 100% of the patients are covered, and then and there are two generics in the market in Colombia. Now that's a little hard to understand, but the reason is there are two different crystalline forms of Gleevec. So there's only one of those crystalline forms that's subject to patent protection. The other crystalline form isn't. So the generics got approval for the, let's call it the E form of the crystal. Novartis has patents still in the A form. Same active ingredient once it hits your body, okay? The crystalline structure breaks down, and it's the same active that gets delivered to your body. That's why the generics can piggyback. 90% of the market was still going to Gleevec. In March of this year, the Minister of Health said, well, we think we're going to issue a compulsory license. The company said, wait a minute, 100%, because we want to improve access to medicines. From the company standpoint, that's hard to understand. 100% of the patients are provided, get the product under price control, comply with all your price controls. What's your problem? And there are two generic alternatives here if you want them. All that's ignored, basically, in the discussions, as far as I can tell. The government said, we want public price negotiations. Our industry doesn't really do public price negotiations. So, lots of back and forth. If you want to read the press on this, there are quite a few statements about it. You can Google it and find a lot of things out there. Basically, about a week ago, the government said, or a few days ago, actually, the government said, well, we think we're just going to impose another severe price cut. So they've apparently backed away from the elimination of the patent, which is what basically a compulsory license does functionally, and they simply said we're just going to impose a very severe pricing reduction, which I think from the company's perspective is the same. Because basically if you price the basically an IP protected product at the generic price, which is where they seem to be going, it doesn't mean much. So what does that mean for the industry? I mean, you can't stop a country from doing whatever they want to do, or whatever they decide to do on price. You really can't. And at least it's very difficult to do. But what this means is you simply have to factor in to whether in their decisions for what and whether you want to introduce something into Colombia or similar countries, the newest products. Because once you're in, the generics can piggyback on the data and get approval. So evergreening is a concept you'll often hear about. And there are bad forms of evergreening in my view, and there are forms that are, but usually the activists who talk about it miss the bad acts. They don't talk about the bad acts. And so they're laying blame on the intellectual property system in a way that I think is unwarranted. Typically what happens is for your first product, you have a patent portfolio. It covers the chemical substance, the active. That expires, but before it expires, you have patents on new formulations. Long-term dosage forms, for example. Prozac is an example of it. Okay, it was a new first-in-class therapy introduced in 1987. Daily dosage regimen was what was in the market. They developed they being Lilly, a weekly form of it before their intellectual property expired, and they introduced it into the market a couple of months before the intellectual property expired. The generics came on the market shortly after it with the old formulation. Going back to the previous slide, you'll see that what people often say is patent protection on the original product is extended by a grant of follow-on patents on new formulations. If you hear that, please question, because there's not a patent system in the world where that's true. Right? And if yours does, you ought to change it. And we'll be the first ones to tell you to change it. What does happen, however, is companies do introduce the new formulation before the generic has gotten on the market, and sometimes the patient population migrates to that new formulation, or the doctors prefer to prescribe it. Because in some instances, having a week-long therapy delivered through one dose that you take on day one, rather than having to take it daily, particularly with someone who has a mental disorder, is a big advantage on compliance. So a lot of doctors, so if you do dosage form, helps with compliance, the patient population might migrate to it and prefer it, and the generic is placed as something of a competitive disadvantage. Generics don't like to compete. They don't want to have to compete against the new dosage form of the old product. And that's really, I think, what's going on. Now, whether you think this is what's happened here is bad, good or bad, that's up to you. There are other things that happen. Some behaviors of companies that resulted in antitrust litigation in this country. There have been companies that withdraw their approval from the FDA just before the generic goes online. What that means is the generic can't get approval from the FDA. That kind of behavior has resulted in litigation. It's also resulted in liability under our antitrust laws. So when you start talking about evergreening, if you ever find yourself engaged in those issues, my top line message is focus on the behaviors as well as the intellectual property, because I think the problem problems that arise stem mostly from behaviors of companies, not the granted intellectual property. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't want a wrong solution to the problem. Make sure you understand what the problem is first. That's my basic top line message. All right, so access to medicines. The market isn't driving, okay? And this is usually called about what's going on here. That's the next few slides. And a lot of neglected diseases, schistosomiasis, dengue, and other tuberculosis, malaria. These are diseases that disproportionately affect developing countries, and there isn't as much industry investment in it. But this gives you a sense of who's spending on these things. The United States is the biggest spender by far. Gates is the second spender. Our industry is the third. And we spend more than the EC and the European Union countries combined. And so we're very engaged in trying to solve that. $94.8 billion was spent by our industry to try to achieve or help achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and that kind of commitment is ongoing. Barriers to access, these are what we think they are generally. They're usually insufficient infrastructure, inadequate government investment, markups in the distribution chain, and high government taxes and tariffs. Intellectual property is actually relatively small. If you think, you might often hear that access problems can be solved by eliminating intellectual property and building your own generic industry. India did that. And according to the World Health Organization statistics, when they did that, between the 1970s and roughly 2005, when this was done, in 2005 is when they implemented TRIPS, by the way, in India. They had one of the most robust generic industries in the globe by that time. No intellectual property at all on pharmaceuticals for decades at that point. And some of the worst access to medicines for poor on the globe, worse than God. So that's not necessarily a solution to access. So eliminating intellectual property, even if you have a generic industry, isn't necessarily going to solve your access. Thank you very much. Sorry if I was going over.